Don't even think about stepping over that doorstep, David." The sentence hit him harder than some of the tackles he'd taken in his career. David Beckham froze on the small concrete step, one hand gripping the handle of a battered suitcase, the other shoved stiffly into the pocket of his worn jacket. A fine London drizzle hung in the air, beating on his eyelashes and darkening the shoulders of his coat. He stared at the half-open door in front of him, trying to decide if he'd heard her right. "Aunt Margaret," he said, his voice low, careful. "It's me." "I know exactly who it is," she shot back. The door creaked open a little wider. For the first time in years, he saw her properly, the lines deeper around her mouth, the gray streaks carving through her hair, the same sharp eyes he remembered from childhood. Those eyes used to soften when he walked in with muddy socks and a scraped knee. Today they were cold as wet stone. She gave him a slow, assessing look from head to toe, at the faded jeans, the cheap trainers, the plain jumper, the suitcase with one busted wheel, and let out a short, joyless laugh. "So it's verdade enteo," she said, slipping for a second into the East London Portuguese she'd picked up from neighbors ages ago, something she used to do when she was emotional. "It's true then." David blinked. "What is?" "That you've come home to beg." He felt the words more than heard them, a sharp sting underneath his ribs. Behind him, the narrow street of Leytonstone stretched out in both directions, a row of terraced houses, satellite dishes and stained brick, the same as always. Curtains twitched. A door on the opposite side of the street opened a crack and closed again. The neighborhood had new cars and fresh paint in places now, but the habit of watching other people's business had never left. "I didn't come to beg," David said quietly. "I came to ask if I could stay here for a few days. Just until I sort things out." "Stay here?" Margaret repeated as if the idea were ridiculous. "In this house." He met her gaze. "This house used to be home." "Used to," she snapped. "Things change." There was a rustle of movement behind her. In the dim hallway, two shapes hovered just out of the doorway's frame. Uncle Peter's familiar bulk, shoulders slightly hunched now with age. Next to him, leaning against the wall, was Louis, his cousin, a few years younger, once skinny and wiry, now broader, his hairline starting to lose ground. David could feel Louis looking at him, could feel the judgment before he heard it. "Look at him," Louis muttered, not bothering to lower his voice quite enough. "Used to be on every billboard in the world. Now he turns up looking like a bloke off the estate." Peter answered, his tone somewhere between uneasy and cruel. "That's what happens when the money runs out, son." The suitcase handle creaked under David's grip as his fingers tightened, knuckles whitening. Drops of water slid off the brim of his cap. If he didn't know why he was here, if he hadn't planned this, the humiliation might have made him turn around on the spot. But he had come for this, to see who they really were when they thought he had nothing. "Aunt Margaret," he tried again, forcing his voice to stay calm, almost gentle. "It's just a few days. I didn't know who else to." "Oh, don't you dare," she cut him off, jabbing a finger in his direction, still careful not to open the door wide enough for the neighbors to see clearly. "Don't you dare stand on my doorstep and act like you're helpless. You of all people." He frowned. "I'm not acting. Things are complicated." "So I've heard," she said sharply. "Everyone's heard. You think people don't talk? Beckham loses fortune. Bad deals catch up with David. It's all over the telly, over the internet, over everything. You know what that does to our name around here." He almost laughed at that, a short, disbelieving burst of air that never quite escaped. "Your name?" he asked. "I didn't realize my problems were embarrassing you." "Of course they are," she hissed. "I go to the shop and people look at me like they're waiting to see if I'll start selling my furniture. At church they whisper, 'Is it true? Is your David really ruined? I've spent my whole life keeping this house respectable, and now you're on the news like some cautionary tale.'" He felt something raw pushing up toward the surface. "I've done a bit more in my life than become a cautionary tale," he said. "Yes, you have," she shot back. "And you did all of it far away from here. In Manchester, Madrid, Los Angeles, Miami, wherever else. Not here. Not once did you call and say, 'Aunt Margaret, how are you managing? Do you need anything?' But now, oh, now that the papers are saying you've lost everything, here you are. On my step." He swallowed. The worst part was that buried somewhere inside her bitterness was a fragment of truth. He had drifted. Intentionally or not, he had let time and distance push this place to the edges of his life. He'd always told himself he'd circle back. He just hadn't expected to circle back like this. "I'm not here for money," he said. "I don't want your savings, I don't want your pension, I don't want." "Then what do you want?" she snapped. Because from where I'm standing you want a lot. You want me to let you in, sit you at my table, let the neighbors see you coming and going while they're whispering, he's broke, completely broke. You want us tied to your mess. And I won't have it. Behind her, Peter shifted, clearing his throat. Maybe we could, hear him out, love, he said, sounding like a man who knew he should say something and regretted it instantly. Margaret shot him a look over her shoulder that could have stopped traffic. Hear him out about what? We can barely afford gas this winter. You think we can afford to take in someone who's been living on another planet for the last 20 years? Louis smirked again. We don't even know if he knows how to use a kettle anymore. David's eyes flicked to his cousin. I still know how to make a cup of tea, Louis. Louis shrugged. Sure. Maybe if there's a personal chef in the cupboard. The rain picked up just a little, a soft hiss on the pavement. David felt it seeping through the seams of his trainers. He shifted his suitcase from one hand to the other. The chill in the air started to creep through the thin jumper, settling into his shoulders. He thought of all the arrivals he'd had in his life. Airports where crowds had waited for him, banners waving, people screaming his name. Stadium tunnels where teammates clapped him on the back. Red carpets where photographers shouted for him to turn his head just so. There was no crowd here. No flash. Just a closed-off doorway and family members who looked at him like a problem they didn't want. I didn't come to cause trouble, he said. I just thought this was the one place I could knock on a door and be let in without questions. Margaret snorted. You haven't been paying attention then? The world doesn't work like that. Not anymore. He studied her face, searching for any trace of the aunt who used to press a 20 into his hand when he left after Sunday dinner, saying, "Don't tell your mum." The aunt who had framed his first England shirt and hung it above the stairs like a holy relic. The aunt who cried when he moved to Madrid, saying she was proud. Maybe that woman was still there somewhere, buried under fear and gossip and years of feeling left behind. Or maybe he'd imagined her warmth all along, and this was who she really was when he had nothing to bring to the table. I didn't expect you to fix anything, he said. I just thought, if things were really bad, family would at least let me sit down. You have a wife, Margaret said. You have rich friends. You have all your famous people. Go sit with them. He felt his jaw tighten. He took a breath, then another, consciously unclenching his fingers from the suitcase handle. It's not that simple. Life isn't simple for any of us, she replied. But we deal with our own problems. We don't show up at somebody's house when the tabloids say we've gone under and expect them to open the door. The word tabloids hung in the air like a bad smell. He could still stop this, he knew. One sentence. One confession. It's not true. I'm not broke. This is a test. I need to see who'll stand by me if I were. If he said it, she might laugh in relief. Peter might clap him on the shoulder. Louis might roll his eyes. You got us, mate? And the whole thing would become some strange story they'd tell on Christmases when he did bother to show up. But then he'd never know. He'd never know what they would have done if it had been real. So David swallowed the truth and did something that surprised even himself. He nodded. All right, he said softly. If that's how you feel, I won't argue. For a split second, something flickered in Margaret's eyes. Confusion, maybe, or guilt. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. It is how I feel, she replied stiffly. I have to think about this household. I have to think about our reputation. I have to think about keeping peace on this street. Peter shifted again, looking like he wanted to say something but didn't dare. Louis folded his arms and stared at the floor, suddenly fascinated by a crack in the tiles. David adjusted his grip on the suitcase and stepped back down off the doorstep. The drizzle had thickened into a fine, steady rain now, blurring the lines of the opposite houses. Somewhere a dog barked. A car alarm chirped and then silenced. Well, he said, forcing his mouth into something that wasn't quite a smile. Thank you for answering the door at least. We're not heartless, Margaret said, and the irony was so sharp he wondered if she could taste it herself. We just have to be realistic. Realistic. As if caring was a luxury only the rich could afford. He nodded again, more to himself than to her. Take care, Aunt Margaret. He turned to go. David, she called after him, just as he took his first step away. He stopped and twisted at the waist to look back, a tiny ember of foolish hope flickering in his chest. She hesitated in the doorway, hands gripping the frame, knuckles pale. Her mouth opened, then closed. Don't tell anyone you came here, she finally said. People will talk. The ember went out. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Don't worry, he said. You won't be in the story. She seemed relieved by that. Relieved and bizarrely offended. The door closed slowly this time, but the soft click at the end was final. For a few seconds, David simply stood there, facing the painted wood, feeling everything and nothing at once. The rain patted the back of his neck. A drop of water ran from his hairline down along his cheek, and he wasn't sure if it was rain or sweat or something else. He turned away. As he walked back down the path toward the pavement, he caught a glimpse of a neighbor's face, Mrs. Clark from 3 houses down, the one who used to give him biscuits when he walked home from school with her sons. She was peeking through her lace curtains, her mouth slightly open. When their eyes met, she jerked the curtain shut. He let out a slow exhale and stepped onto the pavement. The suitcase was snagged on a loose bit of concrete, jolting his arm. He tugged it free and started walking, making his way toward the corner of the street where it met the main road. With each step, the sounds of his childhood followed him. The soft hiss of passing buses, the distant shout of kids kicking a ball in an alleyway, the faint hum of a television drifting through an open window. He remembered being one of those kids, ball at his feet, dreams bigger than the street could hold. He remembered sprinting past these same houses and trainers too big for his feet, hearing Margaret's voice calling him in for tea. He remembered sitting at her table, eating shepherd's pie while she asked him about training, about his coaches, about whether he was eating enough. He hadn't expected the years to turn her into a stranger who worried more about gossip than about his bruises. Near the end of the street, he stopped under the weak glow of a lamppost and looked back. Margaret's house was just another rectangle of yellow light and shadow now, indistinguishable from the others unless you knew which was which. He thought of his mother's voice on the phone a week earlier. She said what? He'd asked, pacing in his kitchen in London as his mum repeated what his aunt had said. She said she hoped you weren't planning to show up and drag her into whatever mess you've made for yourself. His mum replied, the disapproval clear in her tone. I told her not to be ridiculous. But you know your Aunt Margaret. Always worrying about what the neighbors will think. He'd laughed then, even as something inside him twisted. That's just her, Mum? But later that night, alone, the words had stuck with him. This is what happens when you feed the fire, he'd thought. Because he had. He'd fed it. The first time his PR team called in a mild panic, there's this piece saying you've lost a fortune on some investment, do you want us to shut it down? He'd surprised even himself by saying, no, let it run. There was a pause on the other end. You sure? Yeah. Don't comment on it. Don't confirm, don't deny. Leave it alone. He'd hung up and stared at the wall for a long time after that. The choice felt like cracking a door open in a dark room and waiting to see what stepped through. What stepped through, as it turned out, was predictable. Speculation, exaggeration, and the morbid curiosity of people who love to watch famous lives crumble, even if they had to imagine the collapse themselves. TV pundits who hadn't mentioned his name in years suddenly had opinions again. Online forums diagnosed his supposed mistakes. Anonymous commenters declared that no one deserves that much money anyway, and that's karma. There was noise, a familiar kind of noise. He'd lived with versions of it his entire adult life. He didn't care about them. He cared about the messages from numbers saved in his phone under surnames he hadn't spoken out loud in a while. One cousin texting to say, just so you know, we're not in a position to help if you're struggling. An old uncle sending, tough times make tough men. Hope you land on your feet. We'll be praying, from afar, always from afar. And then silence from others. The kind of silence that said more than any words. He knew who would leap to his side if things were really bad. His wife, his kids, the small circle of people who knew the truth about his life because they lived it with him. He didn't need to test them. But the others? The ones who sent him messages only when they wanted something. Tickets to a big match, a signed shirt, a video for someone's birthday, a mention on social media. The ones who'd always said, we're family, you know we'd be there if you ever needed anything. Would they? The thought wouldn't leave him. So he turned it into a quiet, uncomfortable experiment. Privately, he let the rumors breathe. Publicly, he said nothing. To the few people in his closest inner circle who asked directly, he gave a small smile and a shake of his head, don't worry, I'm fine, and left it at that. To everyone else, he allowed the silence to do the talking. Then he booked the trip east. He stayed in a small, anonymous hotel near Liverpool Street his first night back in London, alone for the first time in a long time, no team, no staff, no cameras. The next morning, he'd gone down to the car hire desk and asked for something cheap, nothing flashy. The guy behind the counter had looked at him, done a double take, clearly recognized him, and then looked at the screen again. We do have the Range Rover, the man began. Something smaller, David said. The BMW. Less, David repeated. In the end, they'd handed him the keys to an old, scratched hatchback that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and takeaway food. Perfect. From there, the charity shop had been an easy decision. He hadn't worn off the rack clothes in years, not really, not properly. But as he stood in the cramped changing room, swapping his tailored jacket for a shapeless coat and his designer jeans for an ordinary pair, he felt oddly grounded. He looked like any bloke you might pass on the street and forget a second later. That was exactly what he needed. Driving into Leytonstone in that little car, he hadn't known what he would feel. Nostalgia probably. Maybe a little fear. He got both, plus something else. A kind of quiet dread coiled tightly in his chest. Now, standing under the lamppost at the end of his aunt's street, he realized that dread had been justified. All right, he murmured to himself. That's one. He wasn't making a list exactly. But his mind couldn't help it. Margaret, no. Peter, no. Louis, definitely no. He started walking again, turning left onto the busier road. A double-decker trundled past, lights glowing, a few passengers staring blankly out at the rain. On the corner, the same old chip shop was still there, though the sign had been updated. The smell of vinegar and frying oil wafted toward him, familiar and strangely comforting. For a moment he considered going in, buying chips, sitting at a plastic table and letting the grease and salt and heat push away the cold of Margaret's rejection. But he wasn't hungry. His stomach was a tight knot. Instead, he crossed the road and cut through a small park where he'd once spent hours with a ball at his feet, practicing free kicks against a brick wall. The wall was still there, graffiti layered on top of graffiti, a faded outline of a rectangular goal drawn in chalk or paint years ago. He stopped and looked at it. There were times in his life when the world had made perfect sense. Center circle, stadium roaring, ball at his feet 22 yards from goal. In those moments, one thing mattered: strike it clean. Everything else disappeared. Here, though, everything was noise. Feelings, words, history, expectation. No clear target. No whistle to tell him when to start. He dropped the suitcase by the path and walked up to the wall. Instinctively, he took 3 steps back, 2 to the side. His body fell into the old pattern without thinking. He smiled at himself, soft and sad. Still got it, he muttered. A couple of teenagers cutting through the park glanced his way, didn't recognize him, and kept walking. He went back to the suitcase, sat down on the cold metal bench, and finally let himself feel the weight of what had just happened. This was only meant to be a test, he reminded himself. An exercise. A way of satisfying a painful curiosity. But tests had consequences. Feelings didn't just snap back into place after you saw what someone was capable of. He knew in that moment that something fundamental had shifted with Margaret. He could forgive her someday, maybe, but he would never unhear her words. You think I want our name dragged into that? Don't tell anyone you came here. Those lines had drawn a boundary he couldn't cross again. He rubbed his hands together, trying to get some warmth into his fingers, and picked up his phone. The lock screen lit his face with a cool glow. A new message blinked into view from an unknown local number. He hesitated, then opened it. Heard you're back in Leytonstone. If you need a place to crash, call me. Sarah. Sarah. The cousin who'd moved away young, studied nursing, and rarely came to family gatherings. The one person who hadn't asked him for tickets or videos or money in years. He hadn't seen her name in a long time. He stared at the message, a strange warmth unfurling in his chest. Not yet, he thought. Not tonight. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and stood. He had come here to test a few hearts. He'd started with one of the hardest. There would be time for the others, Peter, Louis, and maybe, when the moment was right, Sarah. For now, with night settling over Leytonstone and the rain still falling, David Beckham picked up his suitcase and walked out of the park, looking for somewhere anonymous to sleep. And beneath the sting of rejection, beneath the ache of old memories rubbed raw, a small, stubborn determination remained. No matter what he found on this street, he would not let it turn him into the kind of person who shut a door on someone standing alone in the rain. The morning mist clung to the rooftops of Leytonstone like a thin silver breath as David Beckham stepped out of the old bus and into the quiet, uneven street where he had grown up. The houses looked smaller now, more cramped, more tired, yet somehow still dignified in their own stubborn brick-and-mortar way. He held the worn-out rucksack higher over his shoulder, the same one he had bought deliberately shabby to complete the disguise, and let out a slow breath. He had returned home before, many times, as a legend, as a global icon, as the local boy who made it big. But this return was different. No entourage, no camera crew, no designer coat, no brand partnership waiting just behind a handshake. This time he had come as no one. Rumors of his financial downfall had spread all over the tabloids, because he had let them spread. A bad investment, a collapsed partnership, a quiet bankruptcy. Half-truths he allowed his PR team to leave untouched. It wasn't that he wanted pity. He didn't want sympathy. What he wanted was clarity. He wanted to see who among his extended family still saw David, the boy, not Beckham, the brand. And now he stood at the beginning of that uncomfortable truth. He tightened his grip on the rucksack strap and walked down the pavement toward the row of Victorian terrace houses. The smell of damp earth and early morning toast drifted through small garden gates. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. He reached the house of his Aunt Margaret, his late mother's cousin. She had always been loud, opinionated, and brutally honest. But she had also been warm at least years ago. As a child, David remembered her letting him stay over when his parents had late shifts. She used to ruffle his hair and tell him he would go far one day as long as he kept his heart clean. Now he didn't know who she was anymore. He stopped at her front gate. The paint peeled off the wood like old sunburn, and weeds slipped through the cracks of the stone path. He lifted his hand to knock, but before he could, the door swung open with force. "I told you already, Greg, I'm not lending you another penny," Aunt Margaret barked, but then her eyes landed on him. Oh. For a few seconds she stared. Really stared. Her eyes scanned his cheap coat, his faded jeans, the scuffed boots, props, all of them chosen carefully. The Beckham of magazine covers was nowhere in sight. Then her lips curled, not into a smile, but something closer to mild annoyance. "Well," she said flatly, "if it isn't the golden boy of London." David forced an awkward smile. "Hi, Aunt Margaret, it's been a while." She crossed her arms. "I suppose it has." Silence settled, a thick, uncomfortable weight between them. David tried again. "I didn't want to surprise you. I just needed a place to stay for a bit. Rough times, you know." He gestured vaguely at himself. "Thought maybe it'd be okay if I stayed in the spare room." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Spare room? David, have you seen the cost of everything these days? Electricity, water, food? Are you planning to pay for all that?" "I will," David answered quickly. "I promise I will. Just for a little while. I just need a place until I sort things out." From inside the house, a second voice chimed in, a young woman's. "Mom, who is it? And why is the door wide open? You're letting the draft in." David glanced over Margaret's shoulder. Her daughter, Lisa, now in her late 20s, stepped into view. She had the same sharp facial expressions as her mother, but younger, more decisive. When she saw David, her jaw dropped, not in admiration, but in something that looked like disbelief mixed with irritation. "Oh my God," she muttered under her breath. "You weren't kidding, Mum? You really came back?" "Seems so," Margaret said. Lisa approached the door, arms folded. "And what? He thinks he can just show up here because he's broke." David felt the sting behind her words, but he stayed calm. "I'm just asking for a place to stay temporarily. I won't cause trouble." Lisa scoffed. "Right. And should we roll out the red carpet too?" "Lisa," David said quietly, "I'm not expecting anything." "Oh, aren't you?" she countered sharply. "You think we don't know what the newspapers say? Beckham bankrupt. Charges pending. Lost everything. You think we want to be dragged into your mess?" "It's not like that," David insisted. "A lot of those headlines are exaggerated." "So they aren't true then?" Lisa asked, tilting her head with a mocking smile. "Or are they? Because honestly, I can't tell. And I'm not sure which version is worse." Before David could answer, Margaret raised a hand, silencing both of them. "Look, David," she said, her voice softening just enough to sound less hostile. "I'm not saying you're lying. I'm not saying you're trouble. But it's been decades. You went off to Hollywood and never looked back. We barely saw you after your mother passed. You built this big life abroad, and now suddenly you're back." David swallowed hard. "I should have come more often. I know that. I'm sorry." Margaret studied him, then sighed. "Fine. You can stay. But only for a night or two. And don't expect special treatment." David nodded gratefully. "Thank you. Really." She stepped aside and let him enter. The house looked the same but also different. The old sofa still sagged in the middle, the family photos still lined the wall, but there were signs of wear everywhere. Cracked tiles, dim lights, peeling wallpaper. Lisa stood in the doorway to the living room, arms crossed, examining him like he was an unwanted stray dog. "So," she said, "where's the rest of your stuff?" David lifted the rucksack. "Just this." She blinked. "That's it." "That's it," he repeated. "You really are broke," she whispered, half in shock, half in judgment. David felt the comment like a knife between the ribs but kept his face straight. Margaret motioned down the hall. Spare rooms this way. But don't get too comfortable. He followed her, hearing Lisa whisper behind him, can't believe he's back. This is going to be such a mess. Inside the small spare room, a single bed leaned against the wall, covered in an old floral blanket. A desk sat crooked near the window, and a stack of dusty boxes rested in the corner. It's not fancy, Margaret said, but it's what we have. It's perfect, David replied softly. Thank you. She turned to leave. We'll talk more later. I need to make tea. When the door closed, David dropped onto the bed with a slow exhale. His mind raced. He had come here expecting discomfort. He had prepared himself for awkwardness. But he hadn't expected the coldness, the distance, the suspicion. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was something more complex, something rooted in years of separation and resentment. He rubbed his temples. Maybe this whole idea was a mistake. But then he remembered why he was doing this. Why he allowed the media to paint him as a man who had lost everything. Why he carried the rucksack instead of a suitcase. He wanted the truth. And sometimes the truth hurt. Later that afternoon, Margaret called from the kitchen. David, tea's ready. He walked in to find Margaret at the table, sipping from her faded floral mug. Lisa sat across from her, scrolling on her phone. David approached quietly. Can I sit? Obviously, Lisa muttered. He pulled out a chair. Margaret pushed a cup towards him. Tea. No sugar. We ran out. David nodded, even though he preferred 2 sugars. For a moment, they drank in silence. Then Margaret sighed. I suppose I should ask, what exactly happened, David? How did you end up like this? You had everything. He hesitated. Things go wrong sometimes. I invested in something I shouldn't have trusted. And I let it get out of hand. Lisa scoffed without looking up. So basically, you messed up. David ignored the comment. I'm trying to start fresh. Quietly. So you came here, Margaret said. Yes. Lisa finally looked up. And what? You think this is some kind of redemption story? You'll live here for a week, find yourself, then go back to your mansion in America? David paused. I don't have a mansion anymore. She blinked, surprised at the sincerity in his voice. I came back because I didn't know where else to go, he admitted. Because I hoped family might understand. That softened Margaret's expression for the first time. But before she could speak, someone knocked loudly on the front door. Margaret rose. Probably Greg borrowing money again. But when she opened the door, a tall man in a cheap tracksuit entered without waiting. Well, look what the wind dragged in, he announced loudly. The superstar who crashed and burned. It was Greg, Margaret's older son. He reeked of cigarette smoke and arrogance. David stood up politely. Hey Greg, good to see you. Oh, it's lovely for you, I'm sure. Greg slapped him on the shoulder harder than necessary. How's life as a bankrupt? Tabloids had a field day, mate. You sure you're not filming some documentary here? Lisa rolled her eyes. Be nice. What? I'm just asking, Greg said with a grin. Can't believe you're actually staying here. Desperate times, huh? David kept his calm. We all go through things, Greg. Greg smirked. Not all of us, Davy boy. Some of us live in the real world. Greg, Margaret warned. But Greg ignored her. He leaned in close to David. So tell me honestly, how much did you actually lose? Millions? Tens of millions? I mean, you must have been stupid to let it slip away. Greg. Margaret snapped. David breathed slowly. I made mistakes. It happens. Greg laughed. Yeah, well, if you need pocket change, I can loan you 20 quid. Interest rates brutal though. Lisa shook her head in disgust. You're unbelievable. Oh, come on. It's funny. David calmly returned to his seat. He had dealt with far worse insults in stadiums filled with thousands. He could handle Greg. But something heavy settled in his chest. This family didn't see him as a relative in need. They saw him as an opportunity to mock. Hours later, after dinner filled with backhanded compliments and veiled jabs, David retreated to the spare room. He closed the door softly and leaned against it, eyes closed. He felt tired. Not physically but emotionally, exhausted in a way only disappointment could cause. He sat on the bed, staring at the window. Cars passed in the distance. Teenagers laughed on the pavement. Somewhere, a siren wailed. He took out the folded note he kept in his pocket, the one written in his own handwriting a week before he began this experiment. Find out who still cares for the man, not the fame. He read it slowly. But today's answer had been harsh. He placed the note back in his pocket just as footsteps approached his door. A gentle knock followed. David blinked. "Come in." The door opened slightly, and Lisa stepped inside. Her expression was softer, guilt-ridden even. "Hey," she said quietly. "Can I talk to you for a sec?" David nodded. "Of course." She sat at the edge of the bed, legs crossed, eyes fixed on her hands. "I know we were harsh earlier, Mom and I. And Greg, well, Greg's just Greg." David offered a small smile. "It's okay. Really?" "It's not," she insisted. "It's just, we didn't know how to act. We've never seen you like this. And the tabloids, people here actually believe them. It made everything messy." David listened silently. Lisa exhaled. "When I saw you at the door, I wasn't just surprised. I was scared. Scared of what it meant. Scared because you're family, but also because you've become this huge figure no one knows how to talk to normally. And now suddenly you're back. And you look lost." David swallowed. "I came back because I didn't know where else to go." She nodded slowly. "Yeah, I can see that now." There was a long pause. Then she said quietly, "I'm sorry, David." He met her eyes, and for the first time since arriving he felt warmth. Real warmth. "Thank you," he said softly. She stood. "I'll talk to Mom. Tomorrow will be better." David nodded, grateful. As she left the room, he sat back on the bed and closed his eyes. Tomorrow. He hoped it would be better. But somewhere deep down, he sensed that his journey, the one he had started by pretending to be a man who had lost everything, was about to uncover truths far more complicated than he had ever expected. And this was only the beginning. The next morning arrived with a pale, gray sky hanging low over Leytonstone, the kind of sky that always made the houses look a little older and the streets a little lonelier. David Beckham awakened slowly, blinking at the cracked ceiling above him. For a moment he didn't remember where he was. The thin floral blanket felt foreign. The lumpy mattress beneath him felt even stranger. Then the reality returned like a cold breeze slipping through the window. He was back home in the spare room of Aunt Margaret's house, living the version of himself he had chosen for this strange experiment. The broke Beckham, the one newspapers pitted and strangers whispered about. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. His back ached slightly from the mattress springs digging into him during the night, but he didn't complain. He had grown used to comfort, to soft beds, to pristine linens, to hotel rooms where even the pillows felt more expensive than most furniture. Now he was relearning what ordinary meant. The house was quiet. Too quiet. He checked his phone. Already past 9 a.m. Usually the family would be clattering dishes, shouting at each other, moving around with the chaos of a lived-in home. Instead, the silence felt like an omen. He swung his legs off the bed and stood. The floorboards creaked under his weight. Walking into the hallway, he noticed Lisa's room empty. Margaret's door was open, the bed neatly made. The living room was vacant too. He frowned. Had they gone out intentionally? Had they avoided him? He reached the kitchen and stopped. On the table, a single piece of paper lay under a mug. He pulled it out carefully. "David, we had to step out early. Errands. Don't wait up. There's toast in the cupboard." No signature. No warmth. Just a note that felt more like a dismissal than a courtesy. He sighed, placing it back on the table. His stomach grumbled. He opened the cupboard to find stale bread and half a jar of peanut butter. He prepared a small breakfast, ate quietly, and rinsed the plate afterward. As he stood at the sink, he noticed his reflection in the window. Tired eyes, messy hair, clothes that looked even more worn in daylight. He barely recognized himself. After finishing, he decided to take a short walk. Maybe breathing the cold morning air would clear the heaviness inside him. He stepped outside. The street was buzzing now. Neighbors leaving for work, children in school uniforms rushing with backpacks, the postman pushing his cart. Normal life, normal routines. As he walked, some people stared at him. Not in admiration, not with excitement, but with the uneasy curiosity of those who had read rumors and were waiting to confirm them. A few whispered behind hands. One man across the street bumped his friend with an elbow and pointed discreetly. David pretended not to notice, even though he felt every gaze like a small bruise. He passed by the old football pitch where he had spent his childhood evenings. The metal goalposts were rusted, the paint faded, but the field still had that familiar smell of damp grass and muddy patches. He smiled faintly. Then he heard a voice. "David?" He turned. Standing near the edge of the field was a young woman with auburn hair tied back in a ponytail. She wore blue scrubs and a fleece jacket, holding a takeaway coffee cup. When she saw his face clearly, her expression softened into something he hadn't seen since arriving, genuine warmth. Sarah, his cousin, technically second cousin, smiled and walked toward him. I thought that was you. I wasn't sure at first. You look different. He chuckled weakly. I suppose I do. She looked him over, not judgmentally, not pityingly, but with concern. I heard you were back in town, but I didn't expect to run into you here. What are you doing out so early? Just needed air, he admitted. Margaret and Lisa left before I woke up. Sarah raised an eyebrow knowingly. Let me guess, they didn't exactly leave you a full English breakfast. He laughed softly. Something like that. Sarah took a sip of her coffee, then looked at him again, her gaze gentle. Are you okay? It was such a simple question. Yet no one had asked it yesterday. Not once. He opened his mouth, then closed it. After a moment, he said quietly, It's been harder than I expected. Sarah nodded with understanding. I can imagine. They both stood there for a moment, watching the wind rustle through the trees at the far end of the field. Then she said, Come on. You're freezing and you look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. I was just on my way home. Let me make you some tea. David blinked. I don't want to trouble you. You're not, she interrupted firmly. Your family. The word struck him so strongly he almost had to look away. Your family. How long had it been since someone said that without sarcasm? Without reservation? He followed her to her small apartment, a cozy two-story building with ivy growing up one side. Inside, the home smelled of lavender and fresh laundry. Her furniture was mismatched but warm. Little crocheted coasters rested on the coffee table, and a collection of mugs with cheesy motivational quotes filled a shelf. Sit, she said, pointing to the sofa. I'll make tea. He sat down, feeling the warmth of the place wrap around him gently. He watched Sarah move through the kitchen with practiced ease. You're still working at the hospital? He asked. Yep, she called out. Nurses don't get days off often. But today I have a half shift, thankfully. My feet needed the break. She returned with 2 steaming mugs. He took one gratefully. You seem the same, he said thoughtfully. Stable. Grounded. Like you haven't changed. Sarah shrugged softly. Someone has to stay normal in this family. He smiled. Fair point. She sat down next to him. David, I heard the rumors. About everything. But I didn't want to bother you before I knew what was real. Are you really in trouble? He hesitated. Then he exhaled. I'm not as bad as the newspapers say, he admitted. But I'm not great either. I made a mistake. A few mistakes. I lost more than I should have. Sarah listened without interruption. He added, I came home because I wanted to see who would care if I had nothing. Her eyes softened. And you didn't get the welcome you hoped for. David looked down at his mug. No, not really. Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady. Well, you're welcome here. For as long as you need. He looked up, startled. Sarah, I mean it, she said firmly. You don't need an explanation. You don't need money. You don't need fame. You're my cousin. You're the kid who used to chase footballs down that field and come home muddy from head to toe. That's who I see. His throat tightened. He blinked hard. Thank you, he whispered. She gave him a small smile. Anytime. For the next hour they talked about life, work, old childhood memories, her shifts at the hospital, his time in America, and everything in between. For the first time since coming home, he felt his shoulders loosen, the tension slowly melting away. At some point, Sarah stood. Come on. You're helping me tidy the guest room. He blinked. Guest room? She grinned. Yeah. It's small, but it's clean. And it doesn't smell like old wallpaper glue. You're staying here. But. No buts. I insist. He saw the determination in her eyes. The same determination she had as a teenager when she insisted on learning to cook even after burning pancakes 6 times. He knew arguing was pointless. He followed her upstairs. The guest room was simple but tidy, colored with pastel blues. The bed was neatly made, the air smelled faintly of citrus, and a small lamp cast a warm glow. Sarah, I don't know what to say. Say you're staying, she said, crossing her arms. I'm staying, he replied, a smile tugging at his lips. Good. She patted his arm. Now help me carry these blankets. As they worked together, folding sheets and fluffing pillows, he found himself laughing. Actually laughing. Sarah's humor was light, self-deprecating, effortless. She teased him about being terrible at folding fitted sheets. He teased her about her cartoon-themed socks. It felt normal. Real. Honest. When they finished, Sarah led him downstairs again. Hungry? A bit. Perfect. You're helping me make lunch. He raised an eyebrow. You trust me in the kitchen? No, she deadpanned. But I need someone to chop vegetables while I fix the actual food. He burst out laughing. Fair enough. They spent the next 30 minutes preparing lunch, pasta, roasted vegetables, and garlic bread from scratch. Sarah cooked with confidence. David followed directions clumsily, earning playful criticism every time he chopped unevenly. You're useless with a knife, she said, shaking her head fondly. Hey, I'm great with scissors, he countered. That doesn't help anyone in a kitchen. When they ate, it felt like sharing a meal with a sibling, light, warm, uncomplicated. Afterward, he helped wash dishes. You know, she said gently, you should have come sooner. You don't need to be famous to come home. He paused mid-wash. I was afraid, I think. Afraid that people would expect something from me. Afraid they'd only see the public version of me. Sarah nodded. I get that. But you know what? People who matter don't need the version on TV. He looked at her gratefully. You're right. She handed him a towel. Of course I am. The afternoon passed slowly, peacefully. They watched a bit of television, laughed at a cooking show mishap, and shared stories from childhood. For David, every minute felt like a reminder of what genuine human connection was supposed to be. As the sun began to set, Sarah stood up. I need to get ready for my shift, she said, grabbing her jacket. But make yourself at home. Really? He nodded. Thank you. Again. She approached him and gave him a gentle hug. You're not alone, David, even when it feels like you are. He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing her warmth. Thank you, Sarah. She smiled, grabbed her keys, and left. The door clicked softly behind her. David stood alone in her quiet apartment, the fading light casting long shadows across the living room. He walked to the window and looked outside. Cars passed. People hurried home. A cat crossed the street lazily. The world moved on, unaware of the man standing behind the glass, rediscovering something he had almost forgotten. Kindness, family, belonging, without conditions. He whispered to himself, there's still good here. Then he looked around Sarah's home, the only place since returning where he truly felt welcome, and he smiled softly. This was the beginning of something important. This was the truth he came looking for. Are you seriously going to walk away, David? Harry's voice trembled as he stepped out of the hospital room, the gray hallway stretching behind him. After everything? After we treated you like trash? David Beckham froze mid-step. His hand was still on the metal door handle, cold against his palm. He inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower, because the question hit him harder than he expected. Maya had just fallen asleep inside, finally stable after her medical scare. Aunt Margaret sat beside her bed with her hands folded, but her eyes were glued to the blanket. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. David didn't turn around yet. I'm not walking away, he said softly. I just need some air. Air? Harry let out a broken laugh. Yeah, well, you deserve better than us. David closed his eyes. This was the moment everything had been building toward. All the lies he had watched them believe about him. All the cruelty he had endured in silence. All the guilt they carried now that they knew the truth. He finally turned around and faced his cousin under the fluorescent lights. Harry looked exhausted. Eyes red. Shoulders low. Voice hollow. Let's go outside, David said. The two men walked quietly through the double doors and stepped out into the cold evening. The hospital's parking lot lights flickered above them, illuminating the misty air. Far in the distance, a train horn echoed through the town. Harry shoved his hands deep in his jacket. You know, when everyone online said you were broke, homeless, washed up, I believed it. We all did. And I didn't even stop to think. Not even for a second. David leaned against a brick wall, his breath visible in the cold. Harry, I never came here to expose anyone. Well, you did, Harry muttered. Just by being here. David didn't respond. He just waited. He knew Harry wasn't done. Aunt Margaret regrets everything, Harry continued. She's inside crying. I've never seen her cry. Ever. But when she found out who you were helping all along, Harry swallowed hard. She broke. David crossed his arms, but loosely, not in anger. I never wanted her to break. She deserved to, Harry whispered. So did I. David stared at him for a long moment. Then he pushed off the wall and walked a few steps forward, stopping under a lone street lamp. The yellow light drenched his face in warm color. I used to think, David began, That people only show their true character when life gets good for them. Fame, money, success, all the nice things. He turned toward Harry. But now I realize, people show their true selves when they think they're above someone. Even someone in their own family. Harry lowered his head in shame. David continued, voice steady but gentle. You looked at me and thought I was worthless. That I had nothing to offer. And you treated me based on that assumption. He paused, letting the weight settle. That's what hurt. Harry squeezed his eyes shut. I know. And I'm sorry. David took a step closer. Harry, tell me something honestly. If I really had been homeless, in trouble, desperate, would you still be sorry? Harry's eyes widened. He stumbled on his words. I don't know. David nodded slowly. Thank you. That's the first honest thing you've said tonight. Harry blinked back tears. I was a jerk. A massive jerk. But you came out here, David pointed out, to talk. That means something. Harry wiped his nose with his sleeve. You're not angry? David paused. Then quietly, I was, deeply. But anger doesn't build anything. It only burns things down. Harry sat heavily on a metal bench. So, what now? David looked toward the hospital windows, where silhouettes moved faintly behind the blinds. What now, he repeated thoughtfully, is forgiveness. Harry looked up, incredulous. Forgiveness? After what we did? David sat beside him. Strange thing about forgiveness. It often frees the one giving it, not the one receiving it. Harry let out a shaky breath. You're too good for us. David smiled faintly. No one's too good for family, even when family fails. The two men sat there in silence for a moment. Then the hospital doors opened again. Aunt Margaret stepped outside, holding her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her whole body trembled, not from the cold but from fear. She approached slowly, unsure if she had any right to come closer. David, she whispered. He stood up gently. Aunt Margaret. She broke immediately. Tears spilled. Her voice cracked. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He stepped toward her and caught her as she collapsed into his arms, her shoulders shaking. I should have believed in you. I should have listened. I should have treated you better, no matter how you looked or what you had. She clutched the front of his jacket. I failed you. He held her tightly, one hand rubbing her back. You didn't fail me. You just forgot something important. What? She choked. That kindness shouldn't depend on appearances. She nodded against his chest, crying harder. When she finally pulled back, wiping her tears, she whispered, Can you ever forgive me? David cupped her cheek gently. I already have. She sobbed again, covering her face. Harry stood up, watching, tears in his own eyes. David took both of their hands. There's something else I need to tell you, he said. This wasn't just a test. They looked up, confused. I came here because I wanted to reconnect. I wanted to see if there was still a bridge between us. And the only way I knew how was to come without the noise of fame. Aunt Margaret nodded slowly. You thought we wouldn't accept you if you came as David Beckham, the star. I wanted to be David, just David, your nephew, your cousin. Harry swallowed hard. But we didn't accept even that. David squeezed their hands. But you are accepting me now. Silence. Then, slowly, hope washed over their expressions. A moment later, the hospital doors opened again. This time Maya stood there, leaning weakly against the frame, pale but awake. Are you guys hugging without me? She whispered with a faint smile. Aunt Margaret gasped and hurried to her. You shouldn't be out of bed. Maya hugged her gently. I'm fine, Auntie. I just wanted to see David. She looked at him with big soft eyes. Thank you for helping us even when we didn't deserve it. David felt emotion tug at his chest. He crouched down slightly to meet her at eye level. You deserve help. Everyone does. Maya bit her lip. Are you going to leave now? He exchanged a glance with Margaret and Harry, fear and hope tangled in their eyes. David shook his head slowly. Not if you want me to stay. Maya's smile brightened. I want you to. Then I'm staying. The air softened between all four of them. But the story didn't end there. A week later, David was still in town. But he was no longer staying at the rundown caravan he had used during the test. He stayed with Aunt Margaret and Maya in the guest room. New curtains, new mattress, freshly cleaned carpet. All done quietly by the family while he was at the hospital. One morning as he walked downstairs, the smell of toast and scrambled eggs filled the house. Aunt Margaret was at the stove. Harry sat at the table sipping tea. Maya waved excitedly. David, Breakfast. David smiled. You didn't have to cook for me. Margaret turned, wiping her hands on her apron. We wanted to. It felt warm. Natural. Like all the broken pieces had finally found their way back together. After breakfast, David put on his coat. Where are you going? Harry asked. To meet someone from the local council, David said. Harry raised an eyebrow. Why? David picked up a folder from the chair. Because this town needs investment. New sports programs, youth support, safe recreation areas. You saw the state the local kids are in. No opportunities. Margaret stared at him. But why here? He smiled gently. Because it's my family's hometown. Aunt Margaret covered her mouth, emotional. And I'm thinking, David continued, about starting a small community sports center here. A place for kids to train for free. A place with warm meals, mentors, real support. Maya jumped. That would be amazing. Harry shook his head softly, overwhelmed. You're giving this town something it's never had. David zipped his coat. Everyone deserves a chance. Especially kids. Margaret stepped forward and took his hand. You're doing something extraordinary. He squeezed her hand back. You helped raise me. I'm just giving back. Before stepping out the door, she whispered, You truly are the best of us. He smiled. I learned forgiveness from the best of you. He stepped outside into the crisp morning air. This time he didn't walk alone. Harry followed him out. Mind if I come? David raised an eyebrow. To the council meeting? Harry shrugged awkwardly. I want to help. If you'll let me. David placed a hand on his cousin's shoulder. Of course. The two of them began walking down the quiet street, the sun rising behind them. After a few steps, Harry asked quietly, David, when people treated you badly, why didn't you give up on us? David looked at him, calm and sincere. Because real family isn't who treats you well when they think you're successful, he said. It's who tries to change once they realize they were wrong. Harry exhaled, the weight in his chest finally lifting. They continued walking side by side. A new beginning. A healed family. A town on the verge of hope. David Beckham had come here in disguise. But he chose to stay as himself. Not as the star. Not as the football legend. Just as David. The man who believed that forgiveness isn't weakness, but the strongest legacy anyone can leave behind.